I ignored the warnings. People in small towns love their ghost stories, their local legends meant to scare outsiders. I'd heard plenty of them before, and they all followed the same formula. Something terrible happened in the past, and now the land is cursed, or haunted, or whatever version they preferred. This time, it was the Screaming Woods. "You stay out of there at night," the old man at the general store warned when I mentioned my research. He was bagging my supplies, canned food, batteries, a new field recorder, without looking at me. I humored him. "Why's that?" "Anyone goes too deep hears screaming, like someone dying, but there ain't never nobody there." He tied off the bag and finally met my eyes. "Folks round here know to leave that place alone." I nodded, took my things and left. I was in town for work, wildlife research. My job was to set up cameras and audio recorders to track animal movement in remote areas. I'd done this before, in different forests, in different states. The woods at night could be unnerving, sure, but there was always a rational explanation for every sound, every rustle in the brush, every cry in the dark. There was nothing special about these woods. At least, that's what I thought. The first 3 nights were uneventful. I checked my equipment, replaced batteries, logged data, usual stuff. Then, on the 4th night, I found something strange in the audio. At exactly 2:31 a.m., one of my recorders picked up a sound. It started faint like wind moving through the trees, but then it changed. A scream. Not an animal. Not the distant call of a coyote or the shriek of an owl. A human scream. Long, drawn out, raw. I played it back over and over, trying to place it. It didn't sound right. There was no build-up, no natural fade. It just stopped, like someone had cut the sound off mid-breath. I checked my other recorders. Every single one had captured it. Same time, same sudden end. The next night, it happened again. Same time, same place. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. So I decided to go see for myself. I left the cabin at midnight with a flashlight, a field recorder, and my knife. I followed my map to where the sound had come from, about 2 miles into the woods, near an old, unmarked trail. The walk was easy at first, but as I got closer, something changed. The woods felt different. The air had a damp, sour smell, like rotting leaves. The ground was uneven, pockmarked with dips and soft patches, as if something had disturbed the earth. And the trees, tall, gnarled pines, seemed to press in tighter, their branches casting shadows that looked too much like figures standing just beyond the reach of my light. By the time I reached the clearing, my back was damp with sweat. It was nothing special, just a flat, open space surrounded by trees. No signs of animal life, no footprints, nothing. I set my recorder down, switched on my flashlight, and waited. Midnight passed, then 1 a.m., then 2. Nothing. Then at 2:31 a.m., I heard it. Not from my recorder, not from a speaker, from the trees. It started low, like a breath catching in a throat. Then it rose high, piercing, something raw and broken. A wail of pure agony, like someone was being torn apart just beyond the tree line. I turned my flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. The scream kept going, bouncing between the trees, shifting like it was moving, but it never got closer. And then, just like on the recordings, it stopped. Cut off. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, the kind that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then I heard something else. Not a scream, not an animal. Footsteps, slow, heavy, crunching through the underbrush. I lifted my flashlight, scanning the trees. The beam wobbled, catching glimpses of rough bark and twisted branches. The footsteps stopped. Something was standing there, watching. I took a step back. The trees ahead of me were too thick to see through, but I knew something was there. I turned and walked. Not fast, not running, just steady. The sound followed. A branch snapped behind me. Another footstep. Something was moving through the trees, keeping pace. I kept my flashlight ahead, resisting the urge to look back. My cabin was 2 miles away. If I ran, I might not make it. The footsteps never sped up, never slowed down. Just stayed with me. Then, as I reached the main trail, they stopped. The night sounds returned, crickets, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the distant hoot of an owl. The forest was normal again. I didn't stop walking until I reached my cabin. I locked the door, sat against it, and waited for the sun to rise. At some point, exhaustion won. I must have dozed off because I woke up gasping for air, tangled in my blanket, my shirt drenched in sweat. The dream was still fresh in my mind. I was back in the clearing. The trees were gone, swallowed by darkness. The ground was wet, spongy, like I was standing on something buried just beneath the surface. Then came the scream. But this time I saw it, a figure crawling toward me on all fours. Its limbs were too long, its skin stretched too tight, like it had been left out in the sun for too long. Its mouth was open, but it wasn't screaming. It was just staring, its eyes black pits in its skull. The scream was coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, and the sound cut off. Silence. When I looked back, the thing was closer, almost touching me. I woke up gasping, my pulse hammering in my ears. I had never had nightmares before. Never. Something about this place was wrong. I sat up, breathing hard. My room felt colder, the walls too thin. It was just a nightmare, but I couldn't shake the weight of it. I checked my phone, 4:12 a.m., still dark. I lay there for a long time, waiting for dawn, listening. But the woods were quiet, too quiet. When the first light crept through the trees, I packed my gear. I didn't even shower. I shoved everything into my bag, threw it into the back of my truck, and started the engine. I didn't bother loading the last batch of recordings. I didn't even go back for my equipment. I just drove. As I passed through town, I saw the old man from the general store outside sweeping his porch. He watched me but didn't say anything, just gave a slow nod, like he already knew. Some urban legends are just stories, but some aren't. 3 years ago, I took my girlfriend Rachel camping in the Catskills. I remember the day before we left. I had a strange feeling, like something wasn't quite right, but I shrugged it off. You know how you sometimes get that gut feeling, and you push it aside because you're excited for the trip? That's what I did. I convinced myself it was just nerves. We hadn't been camping in a while, and Rachel wasn't too fond of it, but I promised her it would be fun. Relaxing. The first night was uneventful. We set up the tent, made dinner over the fire, and tried to enjoy the stillness. But even then, something felt wrong. The woods around us were unusually silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing but the wind. It was a heavy kind of quiet, the kind that presses down on you. I noticed Rachel kept glancing around too. Maybe she felt it too. I didn't say anything. We tried to make the best of it, but the unease was already there. The next morning, we decided to go for a walk. I figured getting out of camp and into the woods might take our minds off the strange silence. But the deeper we went, the more it started to feel like we were being watched. The trees were thick, their branches twisted like reaching arms, blocking out the sun in places. The air was damp, clinging to your skin. I noticed Rachel kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the woods around us. I tried to push the nagging sense of discomfort aside. This was supposed to be fun after all. We wandered for what felt like hours, weaving through the trees and stumbling over rocks. Eventually we found it, a mound of dirt nestled between two large trees. It wasn't anything impressive at first glance, just a small bump in the earth. But as we got closer, I realized something was off. The dirt looked too fresh, the ground still soft and slightly unsettled, as though it had been dug up recently. There was no sign of a burial marker, no stones, no flowers, no cross, just the mound, stark and unnatural in the middle of the woods. I didn't say anything right away. I couldn't. Rachel spoke first, her voice barely a whisper. "This doesn't feel right." Her words felt like a punch in the gut. I could hear her breathing now, fast and shallow. She was scared, and it wasn't just the grave, something in the air had changed. It wasn't the peaceful woods we had hiked into earlier. It was tense, suffocating. I crouched down to inspect the mound, running my fingers through the earth. It was packed tightly, as though someone had put a lot of care into it. It wasn't like someone had just tossed dirt over something. They'd buried it with purpose. My mind raced. It was too small for a human grave, but the careful placement of the dirt told me this wasn't the burial of an animal. I looked over at Rachel, who was now shaking, her eyes wide, glued to the mound. What if it's someone who didn't want to be found? Her voice was barely audible. What if it's a body? I didn't want to think about that. "Let's just move on," I said, trying to sound casual, but it came out strained. We stood in silence for a moment, then started to walk away. But the air had changed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was like the woods were closing in around us, pulling us deeper into their grip. We tried to keep our pace steady, but every snap of a twig felt too loud. Every rustle in the leaves felt like it came from something other than the wind. Then, as if on cue, the birds scattered above us, flying off in a panicked frenzy. They shot up into the sky, swirling around in disarray. Something had startled them. Something had made them flee in terror. My stomach twisted. We continued on, but the deeper we went, the stranger everything seemed. I thought I'd seen something on the ground, but it was too far ahead to be sure. We walked toward it, and that's when I saw them. 2 cigarette butts, smushed into the dirt, not far from the trees. Who in the world would be smoking out here so far from any trail or campsite? There was no sign of a path, no sign of anyone else around. But someone had been here recently. I didn't want to admit it, but the thought began to gnaw at me. Maybe someone was just passing through, I said, trying to sound convincing. But I knew we were far too deep in the woods for it to be a casual stroll. Rachel looked at the butts and then at me. That doesn't make sense. Who would smoke out here? I couldn't answer her. I didn't know. But my instincts were screaming now, telling me that something wasn't right. Let's just get back to the camp, she said, her voice trembling. Her eyes darted around, as if searching for something, or maybe trying to avoid seeing something. I nodded quickly, my mind racing, urging us to move. As we walked back, the woods felt more oppressive. The quiet was heavier now, as if the trees themselves were watching. Every step felt like it echoed. It wasn't the peaceful walk we had planned, but an endless trek through something that wanted us to stay lost. The air felt thicker with every breath, like something was closing in around us. Then we heard it, a shot, a gunshot, distant but unmistakable. Rachel flinched, her hand flying to her chest. Was that? I didn't want to say it out loud. I didn't want to believe it. A shot in the woods? Who would be shooting out here, miles from civilization? The air grew even colder, and I couldn't shake the sound of the gunshot from my mind. The birds hadn't returned to their normal perch. Instead, they were scattered, circling high above us, their wings frantic, as if trying to escape something they couldn't see. Something was wrong. Something had happened here, and we weren't supposed to know about it. We need to go, Rachel said again, this time louder, with more urgency. I nodded. We both knew it wasn't just the grave anymore, or the cigarette butts. It was everything. The silence, the shot, the birds, the strange feeling that we were being hunted by something unseen. We picked up the pace, but no matter how quickly we moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were closing in on us, that something was following us, waiting. By the time we made it back to camp, we didn't even bother to unpack. The tent came down in record time, the gear shoved into bags with frantic hands. My heart pounded as I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the trees. We didn't speak much as we left the woods behind us, but both of us knew we'd never go back. Whatever had happened out there, the grave, the gunshot, the cigarettes, wasn't something we were meant to understand. Some things in the woods stay hidden for a reason. Before we dive into the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching. I never liked camping alone. I've done it plenty of times, sure. It's cheap, and I don't mind a night away from everything, especially after a long week at work. But there's something about the woods at night that makes you feel small, exposed. Even when you tell yourself you're alone, you never really know for sure. That weekend, I drove up to a secluded spot in Pennsylvania's Allegheny National Forest. I had been there once before with a friend, but this time, I wanted some space to clear my head. It was early October, still warm enough during the day but cold at night. I had picked a trail that wasn't too popular, mostly used by hunters, and after a couple of hours of hiking, I found a decent clearing to set up camp. I was careful about my spot, far enough from the trail to avoid random hikers, but close enough that I could find my way back if I needed to. The tent went up smoothly, and by late afternoon, I had a small fire going. I ate, read a little, and as the sun started setting, I decided to explore a bit before dark. I didn't plan to go far, just enough to stretch my legs. That's when I saw it. A little farther into the trees, maybe 50 yards from my camp, was another sight, a tent. I stopped. It wasn't odd to come across other campers, but this tent didn't look right. It wasn't a modern one, no bright colors or brand logos. It was an old canvas tent, the kind you'd expect to see in some black and white war photo. It was brown, sagging in places, and looked like it had been sitting there for a while. I didn't see any movement. No sign of a campfire, no gear scattered around, just that tent, sitting there like it had been forgotten. I took a few cautious steps closer, listening for anything, footsteps, rustling, breathing. Nothing. "Hello?" I called out. Silence. I wasn't about to unzip a stranger's tent, but something about it made my skin crawl. It looked abandoned, but not in a way that made sense. If someone had left it behind, why wasn't it collapsed? Where was the rest of their stuff? Then I noticed the carvings. The trees around the tent were covered in them. Deep cuts, crude symbols slashed into the bark. Some looked like letters, others were just jagged shapes. They were fresh, pale wood exposed beneath the rough bark, like someone had been at it recently. I stood there for a moment, debating whether I should go back to my own camp. Then something moved. Not in the tent, in the trees. A shift in the shadows, just enough to tell me I wasn't alone. I turned sharply, scanning the woods. The trees were dense and the sun had almost completely set. If someone was watching me, I couldn't see them, but I could feel it. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the trees. When I reached my campsite, I added more wood to the fire, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. It was probably some hunter's old campsite. Maybe they didn't bother taking the tent down. Maybe the carvings were just some bored teenager's idea of fun. But then, later that night, I heard something. At first, it was soft, like a faint rustling. An animal, I told myself. A raccoon, maybe a deer. Then came the footsteps. Not fast, not loud, but close. I sat up, listening. They circled, moving just beyond the glow of the fire. When I turned my flashlight toward the trees, the noise stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. By morning, I was ready to pack up and go. But before I left, I wanted to check that old tent again. I had convinced myself that it was nothing, just an abandoned campsite, nothing sinister. But part of me needed to be sure. When I got back to the clearing, the tent was gone. No collapsed fabric, no poles, no sign that it had ever been there. Just empty ground and those strange carvings in the trees. Something wasn't right. I crouched down, running my hand over the dirt. It was smooth, undisturbed, as if nothing had been set up there at all. Then I noticed the footprints, not mine, deep impressions in the dirt, circling where the tent had been. Someone had been there, and they had watched me. I stood up quickly, suddenly aware of how quiet the woods had become, too quiet. Then I saw movement, farther back, deeper in the trees. A figure, tall, still, watching. I didn't stay to get a better look. I turned and walked back to the trail as fast as I could without running. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, but there was nothing. Just that unbearable silence pressing in from all sides. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, catching my breath. Before I left, I glanced back at the tree line. He was still there, standing at the edge of the woods, half hidden in the shadows, still watching. I started the car and drove away. I haven't been back since.